forestry and forest products, who sent in some remarks for us. So I'm just going to share my screen. He did record them, thankfully. And here we go.
Working together, we can reduce the threat they pose, and we have. When the Asian longhorn beetle was found in the Toronto area in 2003, and again 10 years later in Mississauga, it was quickly eliminated. Now another high-risk invasive species that threatens our forest has landed in Pennsylvania, the spotted lanternfly. We need to keep this species from spreading into Canada to help safeguard the horticultural and forestry industries here. That is why Ontario restricted the tree of heaven under the Invasive Species Act, a tree favored by the spotted lanternfly. Invasive insects, plants, and pathogens are a risk to biodiversity in our province and a risk to the economy. And the stakes can be high. When the mountain pine beetle expanded its range into northern British Columbia in the 1990s, then spread into Alberta, millions of hectares of forest were damaged. And the losses in BC's forest industry were more than $57 billion. This small bark beetle that made its way into the boreal forest in Western Canada is prohibited in our province under the Invasive Species Act. Warmer winters may be increasing the risk invasive species can survive in Ontario, increasing the risk of their spread. Crown forests cover about 2/3 of Ontario and are protected under legislation and a world-class management system that ensures their sustainable use. To ensure communities can continue to enjoy the ecological, economic, and social benefits these forests provide, my mandate involves forestry and forest products. So let me focus for a moment on the economic benefits of the forest sector. Ontario's forest sector generated more than $21.6 billion in revenue from the sale of manufactured goods and services in 2023, and supported more than 128,000 jobs in 2024. Sustaining families and local economies, including in northern, rural, and Indigenous communities. We must protect the forest sector from the damage an invasive species can cause. And as you know, prevention is the best protection. Prevention requires careful monitoring and science, and it calls on us to work together. Each year, our ministry conducts aerial and ground surveys to monitor forest health, looking at the impact of weather events on forests at forest decline, and at disease and insect outbreaks, including outbreaks of invasive species. Our ministry team works with staff from the Invasive Species Centre and the Canadian Forest Service to identify the insects it finds. In 2024, our team found 16 invasive species in Ontario forests during its fieldwork. 7 of these invaders caused major disturbances based on area affected. And the 2 species you heard about in this morning's program, emerald ash borer and hemlock woody adelgid, were among the 7. New occurrences of emerald ash borer and further tree mortality were found in southern and northeastern Ontario, and several new locations affected by hemlock woody adelgid were confirmed by the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Beech bark disease, beech leaf disease, oak wilt, satin moth, and spongy moth were the 5 other invasive species that caused major disturbances that year. Our ministry science staff researches the threat and impact of invasive species in Ontario's forests and how best to mitigate it. And we work closely with the federal government, other provinces, municipalities, and our U.S. counterparts to address today's threats and spot emerging risks. Forests and treed landscapes benefit all of us in Ontario, lifting us up from the stresses of daily life. The gardener deciding what tree to select, the woodlot owner planting an acreage, the forest manager working on regeneration after harvest. All are relying on a healthy forest ecosystem. Through the efforts of the partners here today, we can make progress in preventing and managing invasive species, informing and educating, monitoring and detecting, managing and preventing. It's not the work of a day, a season, or a year. It's an ongoing commitment. Thank you for your commitment and your contribution.
Thank you so much to the Associate Minister and his team for taking the time to participate in our forum. We really appreciate it. With that, let's get started with our keynote session. I'm very excited to introduce our third keynote of the forum, Alexander Duncan, who is a community-engaged fisheries scientist committed to supporting First Nations and tribal fisheries in the Laurentian Great Lakes and beyond. Alex works at the intersection of invasive species management, freshwater stewardship, and Indigenous collaboration in the Great Lakes region. By bringing a practical, systems-level perspective to conservation challenges, Alex highlights how collaboration and shared stewardship can drive lasting impact. His recently completed PhD research investigated Indigenous perspectives of and experiences with sea lamprey and their control. Thanks so much for being here, Alex. Really appreciate it. While you're getting your screen shared, I'll just let everybody know that if you have questions for Alex at any point throughout his presentation, please pop them in the Q&A box and I'll ask them when he's done with his talk. All right, screen looks great, Alex. Over to you.
Awesome. Ani, Bojo, Kinuia. Hello, everyone. Chimigwech for the invitation and for creating space for this conversation. I truly appreciate it. My name's Alexander Duncan. I'm Anishinaabe from the Chippewas of Nawash Unceded First Nation, and I currently work with the Center for Indigenous Fisheries here at the University of British Columbia. I'm joining today from the Vancouver campus, which is situated on Musqueam lands here in Vancouver. Today, I want to speak about Ginebigomeg or sea lamprey, but more broadly about governance in the Great Lakes and how decisions about species are also decisions about authority, responsibility, and relationship. Oh, there we go. I always like to begin by grounding myself in where I come from. So, as I mentioned, I'm from a First Nation, which is in Ontario, southwestern Ontario, on the Saugeen or Bruce Peninsula. Um, the waters of this region, Lake Huron, Georgian Bay, have sustained my people for generations, materially, culturally, and spiritually. My relationship to this sea lamprey work doesn't necessarily begin with management programs or academic research. Begins with obligations I hold to waters, to fish, and to people from my community and from the entire basin. Um, those responsibilities really shape how I understand both conservation and governance. And this is just a nice little drone video I took a few summers ago from the Nawash Reserve. We're a peninsula on a peninsula. You can see the Niagara Escarpment in the back there. And yeah, just surrounded by water. I come from a fishing nation. Fish are pretty essential to who we are as Anishinaabe and people from Nayashingniming or Nawash. Yeah, I just like to share that. Um, I frame this talk through sort of three interconnected elements that are the tagline for the Center for Indigenous Fisheries, those being fish, people, and place. Too often, fisheries science, fisheries management, fisheries governance, even broader environmental governance separates these things, treating fish as biological problems or stocks to be managed, people as stakeholders, or territory to be managed. But today I'm not just going to talk about sea lamprey. I'm going to talk about which species are understood to belong in the Great Lakes, why relationships matter, and whose authority ultimately governs the Great Lakes. I'm going to use this kind of triad here, fish, people, place, as a guidepost as I continue on in this presentation. I like to share this map in a lot of the presentations I do. It's from nativeland.ca. It's a really awesome website, and they have a bunch of different layers um, showing territories, treaties, and whatnot. Um, Long before sea lamprey entered the Great Lakes or were considered invasive, the Great Lakes existed. North America existed within indigenous political and cultural landscapes. These waters were and really remain governed through indigenous laws, responsibilities, practices, and relationships, which far extend imposed colonial or international borders or fisheries management zones. Before I carry on, actually, it's always good to reflect on whose lands you're situated. So here I'm on Musqueam territory, and just as I continue on, maybe for those watching, it might be good to reflect on whose territory you're joining today from. Um, I also really like to show this map. So this was created by the very talented Nicole Marie Burton. Uh, it shows us the Great Lakes in a different orientation, and it's bordered by newcomers, so what would be deemed as introduced or invasive species, and those have been present in the Great Lakes for thousands of years. This new orientation of the Great Lakes gives us some time to pause and let us reflect on our perspectives of these systems or areas that seem so rigid, sorry. Um, the Great Lakes, often seen as a shared Canada-United States resource, but they're also indigenous homelands, home to tons of different jurisdictions. We have two countries, several states, the province of Ontario, and approximately 120 distinct First Nation in Canada and tribal communities in the States. So there's a lot of competing jurisdictions, and it's a very complex system. Um, Excuse me, sorry, I got a bit of a cough today. But all these jurisdictions make up the Great Lakes. Uh, Treaties also make up the Great Lakes. This is a treaty map of the Great Lakes, also from that nativeland.ca. And as you can see, the Great Lakes in its entirety is covered by treaties. And treaties sort of formalize the relationship Indigenous nations had with the colonial or settler governments of the time. These treaties typically didn't extinguish Indigenous governance. They instead established ongoing and enduring obligations. Uh, Obligations to engage from a nation to nation basis, which is really important. And these are the waters where sea lamprey control occurs today through treaty waters. So much of sea lamprey control and management is often discussed through science, population models, ecological terms, but governance is ultimately a lived experience. I want to pause here and let you hear directly from those whose waters these decisions affect and relationships are affected. This is a clip from a story session we hosted in part of a workshop that I'll talk a bit more, which was kind of the first activity of my PhD research, just to get a baseline understanding of where Indigenous groups and individuals are at in relation to sea lamprey and their control. So I'm going to jump around a bit in this video just to go to different parts, but the speaker here is Dr. Sue Chiblo from Garden River First Nation. And I guess if you can't hear the audio, let me know.
Nokomis Jesus the moon. Responsibility-based government is based on relationships. As human beings, we all have a relationship with water. We all need water. Anishinaabe people understand that water is life. It's more than just knowing that, it's actually understanding it. Women are the ones that can carry the water lodge if they so choose.
Oh,
And that water.
okay, one moment. Sorry. I'm not able to zoom across the video. Okay,
Lodge
interesting.
mirrors the earth.
Okay, I'll just continue. But yeah, Sue, essentially at the end, she explains an instance where uh, she was on council for Garden River First Nation, and they were approached by sea lamprey control agents to put some lampricides in the water, which I'll talk about in a bit. And they ultimately refused based on a lack of engagement and relationship building. And then she she likens, these relationships between nations as sort of like a marriage, right? It's built on trust as the foundation. But yeah, I'll continue on. So as you can see, I mean, I showed that treaty map. Um, and these are tributaries that have sea lamprey present or have been found in. As you can see, it overlaps quite a bit with those treaty or traditional areas. Um, as a result, the management of sea lamprey is really inseparable from indigenous jurisdiction then. Um, I'm now gonna kind of briefly touch on the fish part. So I did the place. Now I'm going to touch on the fish, the place, and the people rather. So sea lamprey are seen as a major threat to Great Lakes fisheries. They entered the Great Lakes in the early 1900s through the construction of shipping canals, which opened up the Great Lakes to international shipping. At the time of their entrance into the Great Lakes and their spread throughout all of them, the Great Lakes were already in a state of decline, owing to overfishing, jurisdictional chaos and mismanagement. pollution, habitat degradation. The list kind of goes on and on. But they entered into an unstable sort of Great Lakes and really added a lot of pressure and led to the declines in a number of very important economic, cultural fish species in the Great Lakes. What's interesting, however, is that the blame is often put on sea lamprey for declines in the Great Lakes. And while that's partly true, it's not the whole truth. Um, from my perspective, sea lamprey seem to be scapegoated as the ultimate evil in the Great Lakes, not the sort of colonial infrastructure that allowed them to enter the Great Lakes. People just will open a paper and say, sea lamprey entered the Great Lakes through the canals, and that's pretty much it. And they don't really engage with the mechanisms that allowed them to enter and why that's so important. During the construction of the Welland Canal, there was a flooding event that flooded several thousand acres of Six Nations territory. All sorts of different things like that aren't really raised when we're talking about sea lamprey entering the Great Lakes. Um, they have a pretty unique life cycle. For the purposes of this talk, I think the spawning migration upriver is likely the most prominent, as well as the larval phase there, protracted larval phase, several years filter feeding in river sediments. So what's in a name? We have sea lamprey, we have the Latin name, but names can really influence our behavior and our attitudes towards fish. What we call something is really important. Uh, we also have some Anishinaabe names, so Ojibwe names. We have Ginebigomeg, which is what I typically use, which translates to snakes. We have Bamizi, which means to roll in the mud. There's another definition or translation that I won't share here because it's not super appropriate, but it is a little funny. And then we have how they're characterized in media and academia: pest, bloodsucker, invasive, a monster. And we're really quick to demonize these fish. Um, they do pose an ecological threat to the Great Lakes and the native fish species that are present there, but we're very quick to demonize them. And that really shapes, like I said, our attitudes and behaviors and certainly obscures the more relational aspect that uh, the Anishinaabe people or indigenous people have to their other than human kin. With fish, we see them as relational. We see them as kin. Even newcomers like the sea lamprey, they are still part of what makes up creation, and we have to honor that. Okay. So sea lamprey entered in the early 1900s, created some problems in an already disrupted system, but they prompted Canada and the United States to create one of the most successful and coordinated invasive species management systems in the world. In response to growing concerns from a number of different sectors and individuals and scientists, Canada and the US came together through the Convention on Great Lakes Fisheries, which created the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, which was tasked, along with coordinating fishery management and supporting fishery science, to engage in sea lamprey control. Now, these structures have endured over time and have really fundamentally reshaped fisheries governance, management, and science across the Great Lakes Basin. With particular respect to sea lamprey control, the Great Lakes Fishery Commission oversees sea lamprey control. However, sea lamprey control activities are undertaken through Fisheries and Oceans Canada and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as contracted control agents. Despite the success of those governance structures I was just talking about, Indigenous nations, First Nations, tribes have and continue to experience limited representation and inclusion within these systems, despite our longstanding stewardship responsibilities and the exercising of our treaty rights. So, following the 1980s, when tribes reasserted their rights to manage their fisheries in the United States portion of the Great Lakes, some intertribal agencies became part of this Lake Committee structure. And then just recently, actually, in I think 2021 or 2022, the first individual tribe became part of this lake committee structure. And these are fora for discussing fisheries management, coordinating fisheries management, sea lamprey control, and all that stuff. In Ontario, however, there still lacks any sort of First Nation representation within this sort of governance space, as Ontario retains management authority on behalf of all Ontarians, despite, you know, Indigenous sovereignty and that nation-to-nation relationship we have with the federal government, not just Ontario, through the treaties. I'm now going to briefly touch on sea lamprey control infrastructure and approaches to managing sea lamprey. For those not familiar, I'm going to talk about two different methods, dams and lampricides. So the first, dams and barriers, I have a map there's a really cool map online at that website there that shows all the different dams across the Great Lakes. And those are little clusters of groups of dams. And there's a lot. The Great Lakes is pretty dammed up, but only around 500 of those are critical to the sea lamprey control program by blocking those upstream migrations of sea lamprey going up to spawn. I have a picture of the Upper Echo River Dam. Excuse me. And I believe Aaron Jones this morning spoke about some of the work they're doing to address some concerns from the community about this dam in particular and how it has blocked culturally important fishing grounds for them and migratory species like lake sturgeon and walleye. While these dams are effective at blocking sea lamprey most of the time, they also alter hydrodynamics. They regulate the movement of other species that are really central to indigenous fisheries and cultural practices, and fragment habitats. So there's some good and then there's some bad, but certainly they protect a lot of upstream habitat from these migrating sea lamprey. Another critical approach to control is the application of pesticides to target the larval sea lamprey, which remained filter feeding in river sediment for several years. So pretty easy target if you're looking to control something. While very effective, lampricides raise a lot of questions about ecological ethics, the support from society to continue using these, risk, consent, and all sorts of stuff. But they are pretty effective, and these methods, combined with others that I'm not going to touch on, have reduced sea lamprey populations by an estimated 90%. So very, very successful. However, this sea lamprey problem is a problem that isn't going away. This control program operates on a plan of suppression, not eradication. So the program will exist in perpetuity as long as there's still funding there, I suppose, to keep these numbers down and protect the native fish species of which these lamprey parasitize onto. I go back to this treaty map from those maps of dams and lampricide applications just to show that, all of these activities occur within treaty and traditional landscapes. This shows me, that collaborative governance and management is not only a pipe dream, but a legal and political necessity. And this is especially considering the nation-to-nation relationship Indigenous nations have with governments, the duty to consult, free, prior, and informed consent, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was legislated in Canada in 2021. So yeah, it's a complex system. Next, I'm going to have a little clip from Dr. Deb McGregor from Whitefish River First Nation speak on some of these matters. Oh, excuse me.
Despite the importance of fisheries and fish to First Nations for all kinds of reasons, cultural, social, ceremonial, food, economic, everything, they don't uncritically just accept the way that it's being managed. People don't like the spraying because it affects other things that people feel are important. Some people in meetings have said, well, we're to respect all life, The lamprey eel didn't create the mess. The lamprey eel is more like a symptom of, well, capitalism, development in the Great Lakes. It wasn't like the lamprey eel said, hey, I think we're just going to go latch ourselves onto some whitefish and make some people miserable. They gained access through, shipping through the Great Lakes. And there wasn't a lot of communication about what the management of sea lamprey. We need to think about when that's done. Like, people told stories because they wouldn't be told when the spraying was going to happen, and they would be swimming. There still isn't good communication protocols about what's happening where on the water that could impact people and their way of life, their health.
So Deb brings up a couple good points, and you might be thinking, okay, Alex is talking about sea lamprey control. He's also talking about Indigenous peoples. What's the point? What do Indigenous people think of sea lamprey and their control? And before I started my PhD, we were asking those same questions. How do Native people perceive sea lamprey and control? Or sorry, I should say Indigenous. My apologies. How do Indigenous people perceive sea lamprey and their control? What are their experiences with sea lamprey and their control? So we put together a proposal for research to the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, and they funded this project that we call the 3I Project. And I'm exceptionally grateful that they funded this, not only because it allowed me to complete a graduate degree, but this work had a really high potential to be critical of those governance systems and the sea lamprey control program in its entirety. They've been excellent partners in this work and continue to support our work in the sea lamprey space. We actually have another grant now where we're continuing this work on and engaging with communities. This work was principally led by Dr. Andrea Reed, my old supervisor, I can say now, I guess. And we had expert guidance from an Indigenous Advisory Council comprised of 4 really powerhouse Indigenous women in the Great Lakes. And this point is particularly critical because women have a special relationship with water from an Anishinaabe understanding. They're known as water keepers. They have it in their ceremonies and they're water protectors. So being able to have guidance from that Indigenous Advisory Council and Andrea Reed was awesome. But yeah, this project really emerged from that context I've been talking about and growing calls for greater Indigenous inclusion in sea lamprey control. The goal was to better understand, as I mentioned, perspectives on sea lamprey control and its governance. I'm going to just briefly talk about this. I'm not going to get too much into the methods or the methodology of my research. I'm going to keep it a little bit more big picture, but our work was really grounded in relationality. So honoring the relationships we have already in place and new relationships we formed. I spent a lot of time in community, not just my own, but others. I was able to live in a tent most summers by choice, and just kind of hop from community to community and engage with those communities about sea lamprey control in this sort of relational way. A big part of this work was making sure that any sort of information I collected as a UBC researcher was owned entirely by the community, and that can be a tough pill to swallow for some universities. If the community doesn't want their information included in my dissertation, then I don't really have a dissertation. But we made sure that the communities retain full ownership through principles like OCAP, ownership, control, access, and possession. And yeah, we are guided by the many different R's of Indigenous research and the 7 grandfather teachings, which is a little circle there on the right side. So the first activity that we had was this workshop where those 2 story vignette things I shared from Deb and Sue came from. And this was just to get a baseline understanding of, what's going on in the Great Lakes, what are people feeling. We had a bunch of different breakouts and feedback from those stories. And what we found was a strong support for sea lamprey control across most of those communities. However, there was also noted a greater need for engagement and outreach and relationship building between the people or the agencies doing control, the Great Lakes Fishery Commission that oversees control, and First Nations and tribal communities in the Great Lakes. We also noted some interesting differences between the approach of engaging with Indigenous folks in the United States and Canada, but I won't really touch on that right now. And then overall, the main themes were consultation and engagement, this reorientation or reconstituting, our relationships with sea lamprey from a more Anishinaabe or relational perspective, and then just the need for more collaboration, partnership, and relationship building. The next part of my PhD research was this community work where I partnered with 4 First Nations, so the Chippewas of Nawash Unceded First Nation, Chippewas of Saugeen First Nation, Garden River First Nation, Michipicoten First Nation, and then one tribe, Bay Mills Indian Community. And yeah, this is I spent time in these communities. I held interviews with folks connected to the waters, connected to, the politics of First Nations, leadership, chief and council. And I learned quite a lot. And I'm absolutely very privileged to share some of it. And at the end, I have a QR code to my dissertation if you want to read up. It's not it's not a quick read, but it's great. Overall, I would say the main theme from all of the different communities I did this work in was this idea of conditional support. So similar to the workshop, the main feedback I was getting was this idea of, supporting sea lamprey control, as many people saw it as a direct threat to the really close connections they had with native fish species. And these relationships or connections with those native fish species have been present for thousands of years. They're in our cosmology, our stories. So sea lamprey are seen as a direct threat to that, and there was an understanding we needed to do something about it. Um, Another major theme is consent is not the same as consultation or partnership or relationship building. So the next few slides, I have some quotes that I'll read out. I was thinking about putting in the audio clips, but for participant anonymity, I kind of left them out. So you'll have to hear me read them. Quote 1. There's a better way to do it with less impact, and it's better for the environment and the community. We're going to want to know about it. Don't just dismiss it and say this works best. Let us also have a say. Quote 2. What I think communities mean is yes, we probably have to do some sort of control. We got to keep this fishery vibrant. We got to keep the relationship strong. But that's not the same as saying, yes, I've just given you my absolute approval to pour poison in the Waskey River every year. Those are not the same thing. And quote 3. Yeah, it's not enough anymore just for the community to be involved at the front end and give their consent. It needs to be ongoing throughout the relationship, throughout the whole thing. So just, in some communities, consent was assumed, where, control agents or folks involved in control just assumed that Indigenous communities wanted sea lamprey control. And I mean, from the findings and my discussions with other folks, there is strong support, but it's about how you engage, how you consult, how you build that relationship. That's really critical for Indigenous peoples. Gives them back some more agency, and it honors those nation to nation relationships which have been entrenched in treaties. The next major theme was control without relationship. So this kind of extends on that thinking, this need for relationship building. Quote 1, and I think it's key now to start building that trusting relationship with the control agents, because it's not trust now based on the fact that Michipicoten First Nation haven't been consulted. So automatically, Michipicoten First Nation think that they're hiding something or don't want us involved because it's going to disrupt what they think is right and not value our input. Quote 2, control staff need to come into our lodges and learn the tools that our people have And it's going to be really vital that they keep our staff in the loop of what's going on, and create, not just tell them what's going on, but create a partnership where together they can develop a joint process of planning, monitoring, and having oversight. And then finally, this one's kind of funny. Well, government always comes in and talks. They don't always get a great response because we don't trust them. So I just like to expand on this a little bit. So I mentioned excuse me, worked with a couple different indigenous nations. There were two out of the five that had no prior knowledge of sea lamprey control occurring within their traditional territory. For those two First Nations, no sea lamprey control activities took place within reserve lands, but reserves are a small portion of a traditional or a treaty area. So through this work, they became aware of control activities, and that became really shocking to them, particularly when you're talking about the lampricides and going into the rivers. And while specific to sea lamprey, lampricides do have some non-target toxicity and mortality. And these people were shocked and upset and sad. Uh, and despite that, they really front-ended this idea of engaging in relationship. And this last quote here talking about this lack of trust with the government, that's a key theme throughout all the different communities. There's such a fractured relationship between indigenous nations and governments, from the history of colonization, marginalization, assimilation, uh, exclusion from management and governance spaces. There's a lot of bad tastes and distrust within these communities, but despite that, they still want to engage in these systems and these management programs, which I think is really key. This last one here, relationality. When I came into this work, and I still am a very huge proponent of the sea lamprey control program. I, I think it's doing a good thing to protect the Great Lakes, but I had demonized sea lamprey. I had used the language to demonize them, and only through speaking with folks, I kind of changed my perspective. I started to see sea lamprey as a relation, a newcomer in the Great Lakes, like a cousin coming over to visit you hadn't seen in a very long time. Maybe that cousin's behaving poorly, but there's still this obligation to treat that being with respect. And this it really changed my perspective, and it's still something I grapple with quite a bit to this day. But yeah, these quotes just talking about this relational aspect. Okay, sorry. Quote one, I see lamprey is just like a regular organism trying to live, trying to do its thing. They are worthy of respect, I'd say. They're just like a mosquito. Do you swat mosquito or just leave it be and let it do what it needs to do? Quote two, they've done nothing. We brought them here. They lived good. Why would you hate someone? There's no need for hate. Now, we might decide that in order to keep all of these other relationships, we have to sever that one, if we can do that in a good way. But there's nothing that says we have to be mean or disrespectful or any of that stuff when we do that. Quote three, we have no choice. As Anishinabeg, that's our duty. Creator not only gave us rights to use the land and the resources, but we also have a responsibility to look after them. Quote four, had they not treated in the 1960s, the relationship between Anishinabeg and Gigo in the Great Lakes would probably be close to severed. So there's this balancing act, right? Like you have obligations to fish as an Anishinaabe person, but then you have to kind of understand or begin to understand how you can be in connection with sea lamprey, which is tough. And I don't really, I don't have an answer to that quite yet. Moving forward, so there's this mix of good engagement with some communities, a lack of engagement with others, a lot of distress, a lot of questions that haven't been answered, and an overarching need for relationship building. How can we move forward? This was this quote here. I'm not going to read it out because it's a long quote, and I'm getting almost close to time. But how to move forward. They speak here. This is someone from Garden River First Nation that suggests, this incorporation of traditional practices to really emphasize that relational aspect, not just to the other fish, the sea lamprey, but to water as well. And there was a lot of really good suggestions like this in how to not not scrap the sea lamprey control program because that's what no one wants to do, but to adapt it to be more congruent with Anishinaabe principles and understandings of our environment and our obligations to that environment. I will also not go over this because it's a lot of text, but as a in the final excuse me, sorry, in the final chapters of my dissertation, I kind of aggregate and summarize all of the key findings that I understood through all the different chapters. And I provide a number of different recommendations for both control agents and the larger Great Lakes Fishery Commission to consider moving forward. So like I said, if you want to read my dissertation, it's in there. Now, all that sea lamprey discussion is for me really interesting and raises a lot of questions, but it also raises some uncomfortable questions. You know, in the Great Lakes, we have, I think, something like 180 or over 180 invasive, what is termed as invasive species within the Great Lakes. But we have a lot of other non-native species like stocked salmonids that receive wide support because they really hold up recreational fisheries and economies. I think our um, rec fishery in the Great Lakes is a several billion-dollar industry. And to me, this really reveals that invasion or invasive species or non-native species is not purely ecological. You know, it's really political and applied unevenly depending on values and interests and backgrounds. I'm going to use an example from where I'm from, sticking to the non-native salmonid theme. Um, my First Nation and our sister First Nation, Saugeen, we have been opposed to the stocking of non-native salmonids in our waters for a long time. I had highlighted a quote there from this discussion paper. We say, "It is an insult to the creator. It is wrong." So we have this really negative perception towards the stocking as an act, the stocking of these fish in our waters, because much like sea lamprey, we see these non-native salmonids as a threat to the very close relationship we have with native fish species in our waters. You know, despite being anti-stocking, and similar to the sea lamprey control program, you know, later in that discussion paper, we propose, you know, we don't want to get rid of stocking in the Great Lakes altogether, but we want to begin to engage in a relationship with those who are doing the stocking to share our concerns, to hear concerns from them, and to move forward walking together as treaty peoples. You know, we're all treaty peoples, right? So, yeah, I think this is just really reflective of the whole kind of um, sea lamprey thing. Like some people don't like sea lamprey. I interviewed some folks that didn't like sea lamprey control at all. But they still understood like the need to do it and the need for relationship building. I always like to show this image at the end. You know, conservation, invasive species management, conflicts over the environment. It doesn't have to be like this. You know, we all have a vested and likely similar interest ensuring that these ecosystems remain sustainable and biodiverse for generations to come. You know, the 7 generations we often talk about in indigenous circles. And art like this really reminds us that conservation and fisheries management has always involved decisions about whose lives, you know, I'm talking about fish, are protected or sacrificed. The politics of invasion ultimately reflects deeper histories of governance and power. So to close it out, Ginebigomeg, sea lamprey, they challenge us to reconsider how governance operates in the Great Lakes and beyond. Excuse me. Uh, the major question, sorry, the major question facing the basin now, in light of the work that I'm doing, is not only how we can control a species, but how governance systems themselves must change to sustain and honor relationships among fish, people, and place. So with that, I say, Chimigwech, big thank you. If you want to reach out to me, my email's there. We have website as part of the Center for Indigenous Fisheries below. And then that QR code is my dissertation for you avid readers out there. Yeah, miigwech.
Thanks so much, Alex. Ginebigomeg. That was a really great presentation. If you have any questions for Alex, please pop them in the Q&A box. I did put a link to that first YouTube video that you had that you just couldn't go all the way through with Sue. So that's in the chat. And I'll also put the link that you had on your last slide to
Yeah,
the Center for Indigenous Fisheries.
those videos are on that Center for Indigenous Fisheries thing, and they're on YouTube too as well. But
Yeah,
there's a
perfect.
third one that I couldn't get to, Bill Mattis from Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, but just not enough time.
No, perfect. Yeah, I put that link in the chat for people to check out. We do have a question here that came through on the Q&A. This person says, this is really important work. Thank you for sharing these perspectives with us. Throughout your work and conversations, were there ever any comments or stories about the native lamprey in these regions and their decline, the silver or northern lampreys?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I mean, native lampreys are important, but I think they're kind of hard to see in the environment. They're not as prominent as sea lamprey. So I think there was a couple of fishery staff folks who like brought up the idea or the concern of native lampreys and how they're being impacted by sea lamprey control, but certainly for the majority, they did not come up as much as I had imagined they might. So thanks for the question.
Good to know. Yeah, thank you. I'm just going through the chat here. A lot of comments saying wonderful presentation. Thank you, Alex, for the helpful relational framing for invasive species management. Wonderful presentation, miigwech, Alex. Deb says, Alex, you'll be interested to know that there is a robust special session planned at iCase on the topic of salmonids from around the world.
Hey, I'm gonna be there, so that's awesome.
Perfect. Awesome. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions. I'm just doing a quick scan through the chat here to make sure I'm not missing anything. One question that I could ask actually is there any way for communities or individuals to get involved in your work or sea lamprey work in general?
Yeah. You know, I with the it was 40-minute talk, so not too limited, but there's a lot of really cool work going on in the Great Lakes between control agents and Indigenous nations. This is just a small little slice, but yeah, like I said, we're continuing this work moving forward and hoping to engage with more communities if possible. I mean, we can't get to all 120. That seems almost impossible for a small little group of researchers. But yeah, just reach out to me or anyone on that CIF website there in the Sea Lamprey.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Alex. Miigwech. I really appreciate you being here and sharing your knowledge. That was a really great talk. So that's the end of this session. But if you want to hop over to invasive species trivia happening right now, I think in a few minutes at 1:20, it'll be a great chance for you to test your knowledge on invasive species and potentially win a prize. So thanks everybody. And